And good afternoon from Philadelphia. Frank here with another episode of UFO News Network Sunday. We've got a big panel to widely speculate about where UFOs come from. A lot of different ideas that have been tossed around over the years, and we've got a great panel to sort of dig in on those and go through the pros and the caveats to all the different hypotheses on where UFOs come from. So normally my co-host is with us, and she normally handles the introductions, but she had a last-minute upset that is preventing her from joining us today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask our guests to tell us each a little bit about themselves and do their like a little bit of a self-introduction, since I don't have chance information in front of me. So let's start with Dr. Irena Scott joining us today. Dr. Scott, how are you? And tell the folks at home a little bit about yourself.
Okay, glad to be here. I have a PhD from the University of Missouri College of Veterinary Medicine, had a postdoc at Cornell University, and had been a professor at St. Bonaventure University. And I had also been on the board of directors of MUFON several years ago.
Fantastic. And also joining us all the way from Montana, Dr. Michael Masters, author of the book Identified Flying Objects. Dr. Masters, how are you today? And tell us a little bit about yourself. Hello, Dr. Masters. Did we lose him already?
I am back.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
You told me to be quiet, so I muted my mic.
Oh,
and,
okay.
As usual, forgot to turn it back on. Mike Masters. I'm a professor of biological anthropology at Montana Tech, located in Butte, Montana. And as you mentioned, just published a book coming up on about a year ago now, titled Identified Flying Objects, a Multidisciplinary Scientific Approach to the UFO Phenomenon, which primarily looks at this phenomenon in the context of time travel and human evolution into the future, and explores the possibility that these craft and the beings reportedly inside of them are just us from the future investigating their own past.
Got it. And Rich Hoffman, all the way from Alabama. Rich heads up the Coalition for Scientific UAP Studies, I believe. Rich, tell us all about yourself.
Well, I've been around for a while with this phenomena. I guess 55 years. Got started when I was at age 13 in Dayton, Ohio, and had plenty of experiences with Blue Book and various other people around the Dayton area. Moved to Huntsville, and basically have been down here for the last 10 years. I'm working with the United States Army. I'm in the U.S. Army Materiel Command. I'm an IT cyber kind of individual that works with their networks and systems and stuff. I've been doing that for about 25 years. I was with the MUFON, actually, when it was called the Midwest UFO Network. So I go quite a ways back with that. And then I played various roles. I was a state section director, state director with them. Then I was moved. I had several states down here in Alabama and Mississippi, then eventually moved. I was deputy director of investigations with them, then moved into a role of the director of strategic projects. In 2017, I left basically those roles, and we started an organization called the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. And that's been going strong. We have about 70 plus odd people on board, including Michael Masters and Irena Scott, which I'm pleased to have on board. And we're a coalition of people that are looking at doing projects and studies and research and doing all the good stuff. And it's very exciting.
And certainly, last but not least, Leon Kirkbeck joining us for the first time. Leon hosts a UFO-related podcast over on Spotify. And Leon, tell us all about yourself.
Well, I think, thanks so much, Frank. I think that's probably the first time the phrase last but not least is very not true, because I seem to be the only one without doctor in front of my name or have some sort of huge credentials apart from entertainment. But I'm glad to be on the show. I'm a co-host of a a Spotify podcast called Aliens Like Us. It's just freshly been released in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And the main host of the show is a gentleman called Rhys Darby, who is one of New Zealand's funniest people, and I would go as far to say is one of the world's premier comics and actors. Most recently been on Jumanji and what have you. And he and I have done a podcast for a good 10 years before this Spotify one, and have talked a great deal about ufology and about cryptozoology and all of these wonderful hidden sciences. And we're great big believers in it, and I'd call ourselves amateur ufologists, but certainly we love the subject matter, and really glad to be on this show with these esteemed guests.
Thanks for joining us. And I will add that since I got seriously into this UFO stuff about a decade ago, I have completely fallen out of touch with all pop culture. But I've actually heard of Rhys, so he is a famous guy.
he's out there, and it's fair to say our podcast certainly is comedic, and we certainly take the lighter side of the science, but we take the science very seriously. We just don't take ourselves very seriously at all. I think it's fair to say.
And thanks, everybody, for joining us. And obviously, we're going to talk about a lot of the different, as many as I could think of, as many of the different ideas that are floating around regarding where these UFOs possibly come from. And we do have an expert on one of those ideas, and that is the time travelers from the future theory. And Dr. Masters, why don't you run that by some people, and then the rest of us can basically do what we can to try to tear it apart. And you know.
No, that sounds great. I look forward to that. Well, I mean, the idea's been around for a long time. It certainly isn't something that I contributed. Initially, it's been, I mean, it's really been described in a lot of different ways, both scientifically, and I've had a tremendous number of people contact me since publishing the book, talking about books they've written or films they've produced, more in a science fiction capacity. But the idea has definitely been around for a while. George Knapp told me recently that he's obviously heard of this for a long time, but my research is the first one that he's seen that takes a biological and a multidisciplinary approach. And that's mostly where I come from with this, is looking at long-term evolutionary trends in hominin history, and specifically with regard to our craniofacial anatomy, where the major trend throughout the last 6 to 8 million years since we became bipedal, meaning upright walking hominins, is encephalization, meaning an increase in brain size, and a retraction of our mid and lower facial anatomy. So if those trends continue into the future in the same way that they have, in association with the development of more sophisticated tools and culture and technology, we are likely to be more advanced, potentially even have discovered the mechanisms with which to travel backward through time. And we're very likely to have these same characteristics that are so ubiquitously described in UFO encounters, where you have the big, round, what we call globular neurocranium, larger eyes, a smaller face, but still with the nose, the mouth, and the eyes all in the same place, in the same way that they are in modern humans, still bipedal, having pentadactyly, the 5 digits on our hands and feet. So just looking at these correlations between our evolutionary past, our modern human form, and then the distant future, it would seem to indicate that there is some sort of genetic continuity through time.
So your theory is pretty well based on leaning pretty heavily on these contactee accounts.
No, not at all, actually.
Oh, okay.
I bring them up in the book, and I mention in the book that they can't be considered evidence in the true sense of the word. We can have eyewitness accounts be used in court, but in the context of science, what people see and describe is not considered evidence. So I make a very clear distinction in approaching this question and bringing some of those in. I think they should certainly be considered, and I do so cautiously in the book. But no, it doesn't hinge on the future reality or the description of these forms, but rather just takes these very dominant trends in our biocultural evolution and projects them forward. So it's more of a modeling into the future, which I tie in that alleged future form, but it doesn't hinge on their existence now or in the future.
Okay, and another question regards the time travel concept, and it has been out there for a long time, as long as there's been at least science fiction, and there are obviously some other accounts that may or may not be accurate as far as actually people dealing with time travelers and that sort of thing. That's been out there, but one issue with it, and it's a caveat, and that is the universe does not hold still. The Earth is orbiting around the sun at roughly 70,000 miles an hour. So if we wanted to travel 6 months into the future or 6 months into the past, you'd have to go to the far side of the sun, which is about 186,000 miles away. A pretty significant distance to travel in space. And also, you're dealing with the issue of the sun, the solar system itself, orbiting around galactic center at more than 500,000 miles an hour. To travel any significant distance in space, or in time, you would also have to travel a significant distance in space. Is that part of your hypothesis? Do you consider that at all?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I've heard this mentioned quite a few times, and I even addressed this specifically at a talk I gave at the International UFO Congress down in Phoenix back in, I think it was early September. Because, it's definitely something to consider. But a lot of it, well, for one, I'd like to point out that these craft, by all accounts, can go very fast. So you're right, things move if we think of it as 3 dimensions of space and then 1 dimension of time. But in the context of the block universe, which is the dominant model to explain time and space amongst physicists, and one of my favorite physicists who put this better than anybody else I've seen is named Max Tegmark. He's a physicist at MIT. He said we can portray our reality either as a 3-dimensional place where stuff happens over time, or in the context of the block universe, as a 4-dimensional place where nothing happens. And in the second picture, change, as you describe it with this movement, is really just an illusion where we impose that on this 3-dimensional space. We add this extra dimension of time. But in the context of the block universe, there really isn't change. There isn't movement. And another physicist named Julian Barber has been arguing this for decades. And so if we think of it in the context of the block universe, and if our future human descendants are moving through it in that context, it's separate from how we see it. And when we talk about the movement of the Earth around the sun, or the sun around the galaxy through space, it all has to be relative to something. And in the context of how time is viewed in the block universe, there really isn't that relative movement in the way that we conceptualize it. So it may simply be moving back through layers of this static 4-dimensional universe, as opposed to trying to chase down Earth wherever it may be at any particular time.
And also some of the other ideas that we're going to at least touch on a little bit. Don't know how steeped anyone is in the subjects, and some of them I'm not, but I'm just going to throw them out there. There's a theory from a gentleman named Hugh Everett from, I think, back in the 50s when he first developed this many worlds theory, where a quantum event occurs that basically creates another universe, a parallel universe. Any thoughts to the possibility that, in fact, they're travelers, they're Earthlings, but they may have evolved quite differently and are just able to jump back and forth between parallel universes? That they're still Earthlings, but they just evolved differently. Or faster, or whatever the case may be.
And the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is certainly something to be considered. And many would argue, based on this model, that if you go into the past, it creates that quantum decoherence, and you have a split where 2 universes form from one previously cohesive universe. And if that's the case, you would have multiple universes, that if you were able to move through those different dimensions, you would be able to visit them. There are issues, though, with interpreting the phenomenon in this way in the context of backward time travel, because if you went into the past and you did something that created this change, are you now in that universe where your future is different? Maybe you don't exist there. Or how do you get between these dimensions? And honestly, many people that adhere to this theory will be the first to admit that it might not even be something we can ever prove, because we don't have any means with which to observe or quantify anything in these theoretical dimensions that might exist. So because of those issues currently, and we may discover far more about this in the future, and it may turn out that the many worlds interpretation is correct. And as you said, I don't think it's mutually exclusive to what I'm describing, because they would still be humans. They would still be upright walking hominins with these same traits, but their origins may be not necessarily from our specific future in this timeline, but potentially a separate timeline. So it's certainly something that should be considered, and I'm very open to that possibility. But in writing the book, I mostly adhered to the block universe theory because it is the most widely accepted, and to be honest, I think it makes the most sense in the context of this phenomenon.
Okay. And does anyone else on the panel have any questions for Dr. Masters?
Well,
this is Rich. I want to interject and just basically say that I appreciate his work greatly. I think that's when I look at my decades with this thing, I've had lots of people who have kind of confirmed it, if you would, that there's something about time travel involved. If you take a look at the Bentwaters case, and and the fact that Jim Peniston was touching the object and allegedly got the ones and zeros that were interpreted to be some sort of a message, it indicated that the object that he was standing and touching was basically from the future. The other thing that I'd like to interject is that when I was working up living in Dayton, I had an interesting interaction with Dr. Leon Kazarian, who was the chief of Aeromed Research at the time at the Wright-Patterson, and I had an interesting meeting with him in in a TV station in an enclosed room, where he started mentioning the fact that the beings that they were studying, the cosmonauts and the returning astronauts had basically some sort of the changes in their body from being in space. And we all know that from Scott Kelly being out there, that it has great impacts on us. And apparently his team of scientists had projected out that we would start to look just like the little guys that we get reports of now within 2 generations of living in space. So hypothetically, if you said that, well, we're racing to get out in space, and let's say we want to go out there and to do our civilization or move around, could we then not look like these aliens? And that's what his team was suggesting. So I keep bumping into this, kind of experience around the fact that they may be time travelers. It's pretty doggone logical when you say that you see beings coming out of them, and people are alleging that they have 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head with 2 eyes, and that type of thing, that it seems to be all connected to either here, and that either they or us from the future, or you could speculate and say that they are helping to construct us, which is another hypothesis. And that is basically that they seem to be doing, if you look at the abduction phenomena, it stand back at about a 95,000-foot ceiling. They seem to be doing something along the lines of genetic and hybridization. So, could they have constructed us over a period of time? So I don't know. I don't know what the answers are to that, but it's an interesting hypothesis.
And also, I can see some potential tie-ins in terms of these changes that would take place over lengthy periods of space travel. Some of Professor Kevin Knuth's ideas about the ETs being nomadic and basically a spacefaring civilization.
Yeah, well, that's what his presentation was at our SU conference last year. He wasn't saying necessarily that he said that if we were to go out in space and we were to try to maneuver how would we go about it? And the best way would be probably for us to be nomadic, if you would, and going in large groups. And, if you move at, a third of the speed of light or something like that, for those people, again, going somewhere, there's not the impact of time. They're just maneuvering and existing as they normally would. It's the people back on Earth, of course, that have changed. So you would go out with these nomadic missions to the nearest whatever place you wanted to go to, possibly settle, and then you could potentially have eventually, people splitting off in different directions, and they could end up going out and doing the same thing. And suddenly you could be having humans across the entire universe, if you would.
Could I interject something real quick?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm certainly not going to try to dominate the conversation, but I did want to throw something in real quick about that. Is if we do think about the special relativity limitations and the twins paradox, as it's more generally known, one of the best ways to achieve deep space travel and to return to our own time, because absolutely, as we travel at high speed for long distances, we come back, maybe hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years have passed. It may be possible that we develop backward time travel technology in association with deep space voyages, so that we can not leave our families and our friends and our entire civilization behind to go out on these missions. So it's very possible that the two are developed in association with each other, and that they're not mutually exclusive, that we're going out and we're exploring the universe, but also still able to get home, not just to our planet, but also to our time.
And have somebody you can share your data with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we're going on the basis, Frank, we're going on the basis of thinking about this in the context of the physics we know now.
Oh, yeah.
And if we're talking about, an alien race coming from somewhere else, they don't think like us, number one. Number two, we don't know how long they've been a civilization. They could have way more advanced capabilities and a different set of knowledge and a different set of physics, if you would. I mean, in terms of their understanding. And so it's hard for us to sit back and say that, well, they can't do this, they can't do that, when they could, So it's...
That's one of the things that I love most about this theory, and I have to say, Mike, reading your book, and I've told this to you, I actually had the audio version and in my headphones whilst I was on the New York transit system, and I found it very hard not to sort of let out yelps of joy when you were mentioning things in there. And it makes so much sense. And when you read your book and put the science to it, it's one of those things that actually just is, I guess it puts all the pieces together in such a great way. The science of block time and what is it, do we have free will, and obviously all the physiological changes and the sightings that people see of these aliens and the trajectory of us turning into them. I think for me, though, as well, the one thing that I really love about this theory is that it gives us hope, right in the middle of this pandemic and looking at all of the world heating up, and are we going to survive? Well, if this is the case, if they are from the future, that's fantastic. And also with that, heck, if the world is going to end and we do figure time travel out, to some degree, if we can time travel a population back in time and repopulate the Earth before we actually exist, theoretically, we can keep living forever, even if the world does explode, which is a nice little paradox I like to put in my head.
I had never even thought about that, but that makes a lot of sense. And maybe if it already happened before, we have done that, and we get this sense that we were created if there was some sort of mass extinction. And while we're patting each other on the back for things, I'd like to point out that your podcast, both the Cryptid Factor and Aliens Like Us, your new one, you guys tackle a lot of these. And one thing you mentioned on a recent one, I think I told you before that when I was on my book tour, I think we listened to probably 20 or 30 episodes of the Cryptid Factor. Just laughed hysterically at all of them. But it also, you guys bring up a lot of really thought-provoking ideas. And one you brought up recently, too, is and others have talked about this as well, but the transfer of information, not just bringing people back but the transfer of information from the future to the past and how that may help create some of those same technologies.
Yeah, and I have to say that the science as well of time travel, and I love having this. I've ruined too many really great dinner parties by bringing up this theory. And when I love it when people say, yeah, but the science of time travel is ridiculous. It's not possible. And in the same breath, I love to say, well, the science of intergalactic travel is just as improbable as time travel. Traveling from one galaxy to another. We don't know how to do that yet. We can't figure out how to get ourselves those thousands, millions of light years away. So that is just as impossible in my mind as the science of time travel.
Yeah.
So
I was on a panel at MUFON, and Dr. Scott, you were actually on this panel as well. Maybe you remember this somewhat contentious exchange, but there was a fella sitting next to me, and I just, briefly toward the beginning mentioned this idea, and he grabbed the microphone, said, well, according to Mikio Kaku, time travel's impossible, and then set the microphone down out of my reach, so I couldn't even respond to it. But I don't know, like from that very moment, it was just this like, well, we're not even going to talk about this because it's impossible, but we should consider everything, and especially because he's wrong. And I looked it up. Mikio Kaku never said that. In fact, he's a proponent of the fact that we'll someday be able to time travel. Do you remember that, Irena?
Yeah, I remember it. But, it seems kind of complicated to me because it seems like a lot of things, like people say they see an orb and it changes into a being, or it changes into something else. And that makes it seem more complex than time travel to me, because it seems like something might influence that maybe we're so simple, our little minds are so simple that they can make us see anything they want us to see.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, let's get some of these other ideas out on the table here, and then we can have.
Can I add something real fast?
Oh yeah, absolutely,
to what she said. I was just listening to an interview by Terry Lovelace, and he said that exact same thing, that they were able to give him the impression that they were like little circus monkeys, or other people have described Disney characters, where they actually supposedly, or obviously we don't know how this works yet, but get into our brains and then show us an image that they think will be more comforting to us, to not freak us out and cause all kinds of undue stress. So I definitely think that's happening, and something we should consider.
A Disney character would be the wrong choice for me. That would freak me out.
Or a clown or something,
No, thank you.
Well, right now I've got up a quote from Alan Hynek that I'm going to read really briefly here. I hold it entirely possible that a technology exists which encompasses both the physical and the psychic, the material and the mental. There are stars that are millions of years older than the sun. There may be a civilization that is millions of years more advanced than man's. We have gone from Kitty Hawk to the moon in some 70 years, but it's possible that a million-year-old civilization may know something that we don't. I hypothesize a M&M technology encompassing the mental and material realms, the psychic realms, so mysterious to us today, may be an ordinary part of an advanced technology. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we're probably really primitive compared to, Earth is about 4 billion years old and the universe is about 13 billion. And stars have come and gone and come and gone. So I imagine, a lot of beings life forms can do a lot that we can't.
We do hear a lot of accounts from folks that seem to indicate, at least from their perspective, that a lot of this contact communication is the result of this sort of psychic ability that Hynek touches upon. And one thing, again, like you were saying, Dr. Masters, we should stay open-minded, that I'm not so sure that we should grab hold of that too firmly, and should at least be open to the possibility that some of these contactees are experiencing advanced technology. And I wonder if anyone wants to touch on that as a possibility.
You're saying that they're in touch with advanced technology. I'm struggling with that.
What I'm saying is that a lot of folks are of the opinion that these ETs, whether they're us from the future or intergalactic or whatever the case may be, possess these extraordinary psychic powers. When perhaps they should be a little bit more open to the possibility that this is simply technology that allows for this kind of communication.
Oh, I get it.
Okay.
I guess I thought I'm confused because we were talking about origins. If we think of an origin, but we're talking about the fact that they're using some type of technology to be able to project their presence here. Or,
yes. At least in part. At least in part.
I've never heard this idea raised before, I guess.
Well, I know. I'm trying to bring something a little bit different, But I mean, no, look. Go ahead. Sorry.
I actually did talk about this in my book a little bit, because that telepathy aspect is fascinating to me, and something that's described in almost all instances of close contact, and some without even seeing the beings. People claim to have downloads, or they claim to have conscious interaction with these things that they're not even seeing. And I tried to address that in the book, whether it's some sort of technology that they're using, or if it's an aspect of our brains itself, that it's some conscious connection where we are able to communicate not just thoughts but feelings too, and a sense of empathy. So many people that are abducted come away with it describing this insane level of empathy toward fellow humans, and just this new way of perceiving the world around them. And I obviously can't know. I mean, until we exist in that stage in the future, or we meet the extraterrestrials, if they're from a different planet who have this ability, we can't know. But what I think is the fact that they can also understand what we're saying, and we don't have that technology, we don't have anything in our brains, maybe indicates that it is just a conscious connection, an energy connection between the energy of our brains. But again, I don't know. I'm just speculating.
That's what we're here for.
I think it's a really good reason why, again, it's, to my head, it makes so much more sense that these beings do come from our own world, our own Earth in some way, and the fact that, being able to understand the science of our brain, and if it is through telepathy, to be able to be connected in that way, for the language to be the same, to be able to know how to be able to communicate to us in that way, whether that's through time or whether that's, just purely somebody, that physical being coming back in time and actually being there and being able to talk telepathically. I just find it so hard to think about a being coming from a completely different existence and coming over and figuring that stuff out. But then again, I'm a big proponent of the fact that we are only here because we've been put here by aliens who are using Earth as a little bit of a science lab, if you like. So I just completely undid my argument in that one statement. So.
Well, it's a good point too. I mean, the language aspect of it, and if they are trying to mask their true identity, or if they're trying to make their abductions of us less horrific to us. We talked about Terry Lovelace's example, or trying to implant different figures. But yeah, I mean, you would think maybe a default might be a hockey mask to hide your face, but that would just freak people out even more. They'd start thinking about chainsaw massacres and whatnot. So even beyond the language, but like the way to interact with people at different periods of the past, or imagery or things that they conjure up in our minds, they would have to have some knowledge of our culture in order to be able to do that, I would think.
And I think that there's plenty of evidence for that. I mean, Jacques Vallée's book, Wonders in the Sky, has documented every culture on the planet over a period of history. And we've had interactions with these things all along. And so why would I think that if we've had this interaction over this long period of time that they really wouldn't understand us? And then when you take a look at actual cases, like, I was struck by the fact that there seemed to be an understanding of a lot of things with the Nimitz case. A good example would be the fact that, number one, that the object decided that it detected the presence of the aircraft coming down, swooping down toward him. And then it started to maneuver up, and it was doing the circling thing. And then eventually, when he cut it off halfway across and just cut the circle in half, that thing decided then to interact. And where did it go? It went to the cap point. And that it knew where the cap point was, that it was obviously paying attention to where that was, and was indicating that it's well aware of it.
And knew where it was. It's sort of a random rendezvous point for these pilots.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all it is. How did they know? Yeah.
But I mean, and you look at, again, documented UFO cases, you see that there's these indications of them completely aware of what we're doing. I mean, even look at the nuke cases. They're hanging over, they're knocking things out and stuff like that. They know about all that stuff, whoever they are, if you would. And so there's a complete indication that they know a lot about us, more than we want to give them credit. And does it surprise me if they're doing these onboard exams and having abduction, if that's what they're doing, that there's this awareness of us and our language and our culture and our destructing ability? And I'm just even wondering what happens to them if they abduct somebody with the coronavirus.
Maybe it came from them.
Well, so
isn't that what Will Smith takes up onto the spaceship for Independence Day?
Right.
Yeah,
well, there you go. And
right.
I'm sitting back thinking, and we're going to have them quarantined as well. So,
Well, when we work with chimpanzees and other primates, we have to wear protective masks, and there's definitely the possibility of disease transmission between even closely related species that aren't the same species. But if we're able to interbreed with them, or there is a hybridization program, it indicates that we are the same species by the biological classification of species concept, because you have to have two species that can not only reproduce but produce viable offspring, meaning they can reproduce themselves. And that's been the long-standing definition of a species. So if we are able to reproduce with them, it's absolutely certain that we'd be able to share diseases, and it is definitely something that they would have to be aware of, not just giving them to us, but us giving them to them.
Well, we do see these consistent behaviors reported in UFO cases, where it's sort of like they're flying around, they're sort of hanging around restricted airspaces, military technology. They're sort of hanging around. Here I am, and it seems to me that they're playing these chase games, which is kind of basic animal behavior.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit more than animal. a little bit more intelligent there.
A little bit more, but still, it's very basic behavior. I mean, animals will seek to play the chase game with you. Dogs will do it. There's videos all over the internet with animals, sometimes of the same species, sometimes of different species. That's just a basic kind of playing around and playing with each other. It's these little chase games that they play.
Yeah, and it could very well be to try to get information too, to see what abilities we have with our aircraft at any particular time.
Yeah,
yes,
I would say that we're also doing that with the Russians, and the Russians are doing it to us.
Absolutely, they do.
Does that make us or them animals? No, it just we do that, and especially when we're wanting to show our superiority, if you would, or to detect your capability or something like that, and so. But we're speculating on possible origins, and when we take a look at these kinds of things, as one possible origin is that it indeed is us, but it's in the current time frame, and we've basically have captured and re-engineered or done something along the lines of figuring out how they fly, and it's in somebody on the planet. Doesn't have to be us. It could be the Chinese. It could be somebody. that there's been plenty of crashes. They've got one, they're figuring out how to fly it, and are doing, using it to their advantage militarily. I mean, that's just as plausible.
Well, that is one theory, and I'll bring this up now. I don't know if anyone has any particular knowledge of it. But the author Mac Tunney's, before he passed away, sadly he died just a few months after I got seriously into this. But he wrote a book called The Crypto-Terrestrials. And that was his theory is basically that not only are they us, earthbound, but they're within our time frame, and that somehow they've developed this advanced society and they have these capabilities, and they are just right here on Earth, more or less right next to us. And I was wondering if anyone has any thoughts on that idea, or is familiar with Mac's work.
Well, I'm not familiar with Mac's work, but yes, if you're saying that they could be here from another planet, that they're living basically underwater or something like that, and they're using that as a base.
Mac's,
is that what you're saying, or what?
As best as I understand it, now this is Mac's work, not mine, but as best as I understand it, his idea was that they are simply a separate race, that they are living among us now, and that they're advanced, but they're here on Earth. They are essentially Earthlings, and that was his idea. And I was wondering if anyone has taken a look at it or knows much about it.
No, I've never looked at that. But where would they be doing all the development work and everything else? Making the crap?
I guess you have to read the book.
I
thought that Shane was supposed to join us, and I think he knows New Mac a little bit, but I'm not 100% sure.
It leads really well to things like the hidden bases and what have you below Antarctica, and potentially even the people living in the center of Earth and what have you. And what was Hitler looking for when he was going and looking for these people of Agati in the middle of the center of the world? It's really quite plausible that maybe that they do have this additional technology to be able to live subterraneously, and they're down there and watching us up here, with our viruses and what have you. I think there is some credibility there. I'm really quite keen to buy the book. I'm on Amazon already. It's a great cover. It looks like a great book. But I certainly think that leads really well. I mean, regardless of where they come from, clearly this is showing all of this, the Nimitz case, all of the mind control or the telepathic abilities really is leading to only one plausibility, is that they are way more advanced than us, and therefore it's hard not to feel all the time like you're some kind of lab experiment, or we're some kind of nursery. Earth is some kind of place where these people are checking in on us and watching us from afar, and treating us very much as some kind of scientific experiment. Because if it wasn't that, they would make contact and they would talk to us and they would go, hey, it's been a long journey, just come all the way from, a few million light years away. Can I have a drink and let's sit down and chat about that place on the other side of the solar system? But they're not doing that. They're keeping very much, at arm's length. And that is really the thing that's fascinating, right? Because all those sci-fi movies where they land Mars attacks and all these kind of ideas of them landing and saying, take me to your leader, isn't happening. And you got to ask, why is that not happening?
Yeah, and why aren't they killing us? Why aren't they taking all of our stuff?
Yeah.
If they're so much more advanced than us. And I had a conversation with Chris Mellon about this not too long ago, and his big thing is, are we in danger? And given his background, that certainly makes sense. But the fact that they run circles around us technologically and clearly are far more advanced, and they haven't, and they seem to be just studying us, like Leon just pointed out, would seem to indicate that, yeah, it is more about collecting data and doing research than it is trying to really get to know us or introduce themselves or take all of our resources.
Yeah, if you take a look at a lot of the different kinds of reports you get of objects and stuff like that, to me, it indicates more often something similar to a drone, if you would, doing And especially some of the smaller objects that are reported. I mean, there's some that are like baseball and basketball and everything else size. So if you put that in the context of what we're doing with even our own space travel, we're finding out that, well, wait a minute, there's a huge logistics tail you got to put on in order to be able to get humans to survive in space. You got to have food, you got to have water, you got to have all these other things, and we go to great lengths to be able to create these things. But I mean, it's very easy for us to send unmanned types of things out through the universe, if you would, and to go and look at things and see what they're like. And if you had a capability where you could have like a drone, if you would, that would be moving around on Mars, you'd have now us doing that, and we would see, if I were on Mars, I would be seeing these objects flying around and watching things and stuff. So, I mean, it's very likely that, you know, if you want to go out and find out what's out there, just very quickly send various kinds of intelligent machines off in different directions and have them go and do that. Mm-hmm. And I tend to be one of these people that look at just the UFO and the UFO reports and try to distinguish the UFO cases where you've got an individual that would, or a being, if you would, that was next to the craft or coming out of the craft. And there's a holistically different looking kinds of beings, if you would, than what we typically think of in the abduction cases with grays. And so then you come back and question, well, is this, you know, is the abduction phenomena, which hasn't really, I mean, it's starting to get better in terms of discipline and is hard one to look at scientifically, I guess. But, you know, is it one of these things where that's a whole other kind of like experience? Is that the consciousness thing you're talking about? Is that, you know, somehow manipulating the mind? Is that something like that, which is holistically different than the object that's flying around?
Yeah, and in the context of the technology too, and looking at the UFOs, I mean, some of these beings, I'm using air quotes, which you can't see, but interject air quotes in your mind right now, I guess. But if some of these beings are just artificial intelligence and it's AI that's doing the heavy lifting, that's putting themselves at risk, because, I mean, clearly they're very good at paralyzing us and making us unable to fight back or anything like that. But how much of it, just the day-to-day operations is artificial intelligence piloting these sophisticated flying machines?
And that gets around the G-forces and things like that, which would crush, you know, an earthbound
they're
living
manipulating
animal.
time too, because it could, in their reference frame, be a very slow acceleration. But in our reference frame, we see it as this instantaneous acceleration. So in the context of time, it might help explain that as well.
Yeah, one of the things we looked at, even with the Nimitz case, if you did have a craft that, let's say, hypothetically could move with these incredible speeds, the kind that we built would fall all apart.
Right.
It would basically disintegrate. You know, it couldn't deal with that. And so if you're talking about a kind of like technology whereby you lose your inertial mass, I mean, basically you can maneuver through and seemingly move through our atmosphere without any kind of like heat buildup, resistance, no sonic booms. I mean, you know, what are you doing? Are you manipulating space and time, the fabric of space and time to do that? It's fascinating to contemplate this thing, because I think that's eventually where we're going to probably end up going, because it's hard to get data on this subject. In, you know, UFO cases, we're starting to get now where we can start to see these things in other spectral ranges, if you would. In other words, infrared as opposed to all of it. And so the fact that we're now starting to see them in the infrared helps to understand a little bit more. What do they look like in other aspects of the spectrum? And
is that cloaking too? Are they cloaking themselves in between 400 and 700 nanometers of the visual light spectrum, and we only recognize them? Because you're right, all of these dashboard cams, it's probably not the right word for it, but the ones that the pilots are picking up, it's always in the infrared, it would seem. So are they just cloaking themselves in the visual light spectrum to hide in plain sight, essentially?
Correct. And the other thing is that we got now the advanced kind of like radars, which seemingly are helping us to detect them, which is great. The ATFLIR and some of the more like the Aegis and stuff like that, we're starting to pick them up. Maybe as we continue to develop our own technology tools, if you would, that we'll start to see that there's quite a bit more that we don't know.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to watch as this happens, because we've all seen the blurry photographs that we get passed around, and that didn't help us to understand them at all. Despite thousands and thousands of photographs that people have. So it's interesting to see that we live in interesting times, and I'm hoping that we can learn more about what they're about, and our tools can help us, I guess, if you would, get the data to do science, if you would.
Well, one possible workaround that's been put out there by Dr. Alcubierre is the Alcubierre bubble. And basically, that might be a workaround for the space-time travel and the G-force problem and things like that. But according to him, the basic idea can be more easily understood if we think for a moment in the inflationary phase of the early universe and consider the relative speed of separation of two co-moving observers. It is easy to convince oneself that if we define this relative speed as the rate of change as the rate of change of proper spatial distance over proper time, we will obtain a value that is much larger than the speed of light. This doesn't mean that our observers will be traveling faster than light. They always move inside their local light cones. The enormous speed of separation comes from the expansion of space-time itself. And just throwing that out there as a possible explanation for traveling great distances in time and space, traveling, and not having G-forces have any impact on some kind of a living pilot. Any thoughts on all that?
Well, I suggested once that maybe some of them are images, such as possibly can do with laser or something, rather than real objects.
Yeah, there's been speculation about the like what you're saying, Irena, is that there's some sort of like I guess projection or something like that, a holograph, or if you would, or
holograph.
And there's tremendous energy that would be, I would guess, would be needed as well to be able to do that. But
and get picked up on radar too, at least in some instances.
Well, yeah, because they would have. They're also. I mean, some objects are picked up on radar, some are not. And I'll come back to this because as I've given presentations over the years, I cover all the different hypotheses. And then I come down to the one where it's a hybrid. It's a mixture of all of them. I mean, we don't know, but there could be time travel mixed in with all these other things. I mean, the beings don't look alike. The craft necessarily are a little bit different in terms of their structures and how they look. And we don't. Some disappear and appear out of nowhere. Is that cloaking, or is that something where they're moving through, again, time and space, or manipulating it in some way? It's just, we get into the point where it's like, how did we then, you have landings, and then you have impacts to the landings. And I'm sad to see that we lost Ted Phillips here with the past week. He had documented over 4,000 cases of landings that have happened where physical evidence was present. But I mean, so you have a mixture of both physical objects and sometimes not physical objects. And what does that mean? And I don't know.
Yeah.
How do we all feel about, because talking about the specific nuts and bolts of the actual craft, I think is one thing, and Mike, fully respect your work and figuring that stuff out. But on the aliens themselves, the actual, contact that people have had and as well, everything like the actual being taken on board and seeing all the different types of aliens, everything from the Greys to the Nordics and everything that goes in between there. How do we relate all of that into all of the technical stuff as well? Is that something that any of you actually put time and thought into as well in your studies?
They can make us see anything they want us to see.
Dr. Masters, you still with us?
Yeah, I am.
Oh, okay.
I was trying to back away for a little bit there because I thought I was getting a little too talky.
No.
Don't stop now, Mike. It's interesting, Mike, because that's one part of the book that I really loved, where you talk about anal probes, and that came out wrong. But I think that
you should have seen the picture book, the original draft of that. It was
when the kids' book comes out, that may need to be edited. But the part that I really like of that is the fact that you go into the point that, if we are coming back from the future and we need to do some kind of analysis of the human body and everything from our digestive system and what have you, that in this current day right now, one of the best ways that we can figure that out, and even when we find archaeological sites where there are mummies and what have you, or animals that we need to look at, the very first thing we do is go for the feces and look at what bacteria was or is in the feces and what have you. So it makes a lot of sense that all of a sudden these, that anal probes are there for a reason rather than just the aliens coming and having a good laugh.
I was recently in LA and I met with a producer who was interested in this and had been anally probed as a young child for a long time, and kept asking his parents as he got older, like, Mom, what was with all the butt stuff when I was a kid? And she's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But that's something that really impacted him, is just being violated in that way. Because anybody sticking something in your bum is definitely going to shock you and make you feel violated. But yeah, he after reading the book, he was like, if that's the case, if it is us, they're collecting data, it still sucks, but I feel a little bit better about it, I guess. But you're right. Like when we find coprolites, just preserved turds, for lack of a better word, we learned so much from that information. That's how we know that Neanderthals consumed upwards of 7,000 calories per day of mostly meat, is because we broke down the chemical composition of their poop. And there's many things about the phenomenon that are like that. And I would definitely agree with Rich, too, that, and I tell my students this all the time when we're looking at various theories about, for instance, the out of Africa hypothesis or the multi-regional hypothesis, how we developed into anatomically modern humans, is that anytime someone presents something as black or white, it's almost always the gray area in between. And I think this phenomenon is the same thing. I think as Dr. Scott pointed out, it's the images that they convey to us mentally, telepathically. I think there is probably some likelihood of an extraterrestrial presence in some capacity. I think a lot of it's AI. Obviously, I think a lot of it's time travel and human evolution. So we should absolutely be considering all of these things because we don't know. And anybody that claims that they have all the answers is just full of shit.
It needs to be probed.
Yeah.
all this discussion of probe, I was just reminded that I got my call for my colonoscopy set up next month or so. Anyway,
I know a couple of aliens that'll do it for free, Rich.
Couldn't help it. I'm sorry.
Now, getting back to the stealthy stuff, and Rich, you work for the Defense Department. I think it's kind of interesting. There was a lot of talk, obviously, about the ATIP program getting $22 million over 5 years for their UFO study. There was a study commissioned by the U.S. Navy with Duke University to study encephalopods and their ability, which is really uncanny. I advise anybody go check out some YouTube videos, and you see these critters in action, where they camouflage incredibly well. They can actually look at their surroundings, and they've got dyes within their skin, these little sacs, and they move it around, and they can literally, within a matter of seconds, literally copy the background, and their natural camouflage is absolutely uncanny. And also there's another example with dolphins. They've got a separate organ, a melon, where they can actually shoot out these sound waves, and they can see potential food that's hiding underneath the sand and on the ocean floor. I think that's really amazing capability. And Dr. Masters, let me ask you about this. I mean, what do you think of all that, and what do you think is possible? Could humans develop an extra organ or something something along those lines to, improve their psychic ability, for example? Something like that? Is that kind of thing possible?
I think it's unfortunate too that Reese wasn't able to link up, because I've heard him talk about the octopi a lot, and you guys, Leon, have talked about that on your show quite a few times, from what I remember.
There's a lot of theories out there that they are truly aliens living amongst us. There's people that go as far as explain that the only way that you can explain how cephalopods actually got here on Earth is through some kind of meteor, or some organism that came from outer space, because it's just really hard to prove their lineage back through time, through fossils and what have you. It's like they just turned up one day with these incredible abilities that nobody else has. Yeah. They're incredibly smart.
Yeah, and their DNA is really divergent from our own, and these abilities that they have, and we could absolutely develop things. And coming back to what we were talking about earlier with the question of whether this telepathic ability is some sort of brain-to-brain interface, or it's just a conscious connection and an energy exchange. If there is a part of our brain that allows us to do that, it likely already exists and as part of our cerebra, most likely in our neocortex, that just develops further to accommodate that ability. But yeah, there are other organs that wax and wane. We're probably not likely in the near future, at least, to just all of a sudden sprout some new organ, especially because a mutation that would have to take place for that to happen wouldn't necessarily be selected for, since we don't have natural selection in the same sense. We're more or less just this giant interbreeding genetic drift population where we're not selecting for certain traits or selecting against certain traits in the same way. But there's absolutely the possibility that specific organs that we have now could be repurposed or could be expanded in order to facilitate some of these abilities.
Well, we do experiments on animals where we we put electrodes in and affect particular brain cells, and things happen. And to beings that are advanced, our brain may be just as simple as other brains look to us from, smaller animals with smaller brains.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we can manipulate them, I think I talk about one study in my book about a Dow's Raleigh rat or something, where we're able to make it move its tail with us thinking about it. We collect, what's it called? Encephalogram, EEG, and then the information that comes out of that is sent through a third-party medium, and then causes that rat to move its tail. And obviously, if we're talking about these beings that are far more advanced than us in the distant future, if we're doing these things now in a very, very primitive form, it's quite possible that in the distant future we'll have developed that technology to the extent that we can manipulate their brains, what would be our brains, I guess, in this context, in all of these ways that we see today.
And another theory regarding potential interstellar travel or time travel going back and forth is the concept of wormholes. And it was traversable wormholes, where we can apparently jump into the throat of a wormhole at one end and come out the other end, maybe in a different part of the galaxy or in roughly the same neighborhood within the galaxy, but in a different time. And I was wondering if anyone has any thoughts on that idea.
Well, I think that goes part and parcel with the Alcubierre drive. I think that the idea of that was that you're manipulating the forward motion of the craft by basically creating a wormhole in front of the craft. If I'm correct about that, I recall a presentation that Dr. Eric Davis gave back in 2013 at MUFON. And it was talking about you having basically a craft that would use a Alcubierre drive and altering space in front of it, and then popping through a wormhole, and then being able to get to the other side of the universe, if you would, or in a different even time. But again, very speculative. I mean, I don't know that we're anywhere near something like that. It's just all hypothetical.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's what we're here for, basically.
Yeah, and so concepts are out there like left and right in terms of propulsion systems and ability to manipulate the space-time metric, if you would. I know that Hal Puthoff and them were working on the what they call the polarizable vacuum around a craft or an object, and it's kind of consistent with that patent that Salvatore Pais, I guess that's how you say his name, from the Navy, had published with the patents that he put out that looked like the Tic Tac. So the whole concept there was, again, some sort of a means of being able to create, if you would, like a bubble, if you would, around the craft that you're in, and then somehow be able to manipulate the space-time metric, if you would, that they're calling that. And then you're able to slipstream through, not have any kind of mass. And there's all kinds of ideas.
One of my favorite books growing up was one by Kip Thorne. He's a physicist. I think he was at Caltech or somewhere in California, but he just won a Nobel Prize for his work in detecting gravity waves. The name of the book was Black Holes and Time Warps, and he's sort of the main proponent of the wormhole as a means with which to traverse vast distances. And he was mostly looking at it in this context, and he was commissioned as a consultant for Contact, Carl Sagan's book, and then film. And he points out a number of problems with it, mostly related to keeping it open because of the massive gravitational forces that would be sucking everything in, the tidal forces that would rip you apart. Right. If it takes a singularity to create this thing, how do you pass through an infinitely dense singularity and all of the problems that would go along with that? And he and his grad students proposed what they referred to as exotic matter as a way of propping these open. So it's speculative, it's theoretical, but if we were able to find some force that repelled that constrictive force of gravity to keep the wormhole open in these two different places, then potentially we could use that for interstellar travel.
And I do know that Sagan and Thorne did communicate a bit. And I did read an interview with Thorne where he had mentioned that the one thing that Sagan brought up to him was that while it's important to try to figure out what is possible for the most advanced civilization, it's also important to consider what is impossible even for the most advanced civilization. And I think that's a really interesting idea. Some other ideas have gotten out there. Dr. Freeman Dyson had recently passed away. Earlier, Rich, you had mentioned Ted Phillips, but Dr. Dyson passed away within the last couple of weeks or so. And he was famous for his Dyson sphere idea. And some of those more advanced ideas, anyone have any thoughts on those? Like the Dyson sphere and some of the others. I know that was it was brought up that there was at least a possibility that Tabby's star might be evidence of a Dyson sphere. That didn't prove to be the case, but that is an idea that has at least gotten some traction in serious scientific circles.
Well, just super quickly back to the before we move on from the wormhole concept, I read recently that a Harvard physicist, a guy Daniel Jeffries, I think, was actually proved that it would be plausible for man to make a wormhole. But in the same sentence, he also proved through that a wormhole would actually be a lot slower to go through than just going there directly. So he kind of sort of undone himself.
That's interesting.
But the sphere, I haven't heard much, so I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I would say within the last couple of years, there was something called Tabby's star. You could search that out pretty easily. And where they had discovered a star that was dimming on a consistent basis. And now they seem to be of the opinion, after some closer observation, that it was in fact just some stellar dust going around the star that was causing that. But at least initially they thought that there was a chance that it might be evidence of a Dyson sphere.
Well, they've been joking around about the star, what they call Betelgeuse in Orion, that it's been varying in light intensity, and that some people joke maybe that's a Dyson sphere too.
And also that it might be going supernova.
Yeah, they've said that too. And it's been variable all along, but I guess it's been varying more than it usually does recently.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. If it does go supernova, we don't see those too often. So that would be a real interesting astronomical experience if it happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty close star too.
And go ahead.
Very big. I know. I was just saying it's very big too. By the way,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to be in the neighborhood when that goes off, if it does, in our lifetimes. And moving along, another theory that has gotten some increasing attention would be the simulation theory. This one goes a little bit closer to our very existence. I personally find it kind of fascinating, and it would seem to explain all the weird phenomena that go on, because all it really is at its core is just coders who want to insert a few Easter eggs in our existence, just to drive us nuts, I suppose, and see what the reaction is. But that one's gotten more attention, and I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on all that.
This theory is second only to my favorite Mike P. Masters theory of time travel. And the fact that it explains so much more than even UFOs, UAPs, and aliens. It could explain everything from ghosts to miracles to to everything. And the fact that if this is all just a simulation, and if this is just the Matrix, effectively, and I love the fact that the Bank of America actually did a study to try and prove whether we're in the Matrix, and they came out, I think it was over 50% chance of us living in the Matrix, purely by the fact that if there is only one original run of life and then multiple millions of reruns, the fact that we think that we are in the very first original concept, if you like, before all of the multiple reruns is actually quite naive. It's actually far more likely that we're statistically part of a rerun of a simulation. And the fact that they even bothered to do that study it fascinates me. But the thing that I love about it is the fact that it explains so many different strange things.
I think it's also possible, as much as I'm disappointed to admit it, we might not just be in a simulation, but we might just be a beta test.
I'd like to get the coder who came up with coronavirus and anal probes.
There you go. Exactly.
Well, I was again ruining another perfectly great dinner party the other night by talking about this theory, with lots of rolling eyes all around me, but I didn't care. And I pointed out a fact that they said, yeah, well, then why do so many bad things happen? And my point was, when you go to Disneyland, which in itself is kind of a simulation of life, right? You're going there to escape real life. You're going because you want everything to be great. Everything's not lovely flowers and butterflies. There's terrifying rides and jump scares and roller coasters which make you feel like you're about to die. We pay to have pain and fear inserted into us at the happiest place on earth. So if it is a simulation, why wouldn't we want? If a coder said, "Now I'm about to put you in," now you've got the option of leading a lovely, lovely, little house on the prairie life here with nothing going wrong, beautiful existence, or we can pepper it up a little bit and put some weird shit in there. You'd be mental to just not take a little bit of risk, surely.
Yeah. That's a really good way of looking at that. I like that.
Well, there's no way to really prove that whether we are in reality or virtual reality, because we'd have to get out. If we're in virtual reality, we'd have to get out of it to figure out whether we were in it.
And maybe it's horrible. I mean, that was the premise behind the Matrix, that he got out and was like, "Oh man, this is terrible." It was like weird octopus robots attack. Yeah, put me back in, man. This sucks.
You know what happened to me the other day, which I'm all the time. This is revealing way too much, but I'm all the time sort of like on the hunt for reasons that we're in the Matrix, and just as a little hobby, side hobby that is. And the other day I was driving to work and the radio was on, and I live in New York, so there's many, potholes and bumps and what have you. And my car had a pretty sizable bump. And I swear the woman who was talking on the radio at the time, her voice jumped at the exact same point as if she was in the car and she was disturbed by the fact I went over a pothole. And at that moment I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if the coders forgot to put in the fact on that day that if somebody is on the radio, they don't get affected by a speed bump, but if somebody's in the car, they do. And this woman, was affected by my speed bump purely from a coding error. So I think I've proved it, guys. We're in the Matrix.
Yeah, that's it. It's all settled. It's all settled.
It's interesting too when you look at the quantum world as compared to the Newtonian world, because I keep bumping into the Newtonian world kind of construct. If I tried to think about going through like packets of energy packets that are, have no space and all this other stuff, I'm going like, well, wait a minute, that didn't hurt as bad, but I still live in a Newtonian world where I bump my head and then doggone it hurts, So yeah, I got to get out of here. But
yeah, I appreciate it, Rich. Thanks for coming on again.
Okay, you take care. It's great talking to everybody, and thanks for having me on.
Okay,
and take care, Rich.
Dr. Masters, you have to step away for a bit, or because we're getting down to the point where I think we've covered everything. Unless somebody else has something to add, we can wrap up here.
I would just like to reiterate something, I guess, if I could be so brazen as to do so. That I think there's a lot of unnecessary infighting and contention, and it's not necessarily. I kind of expected it more from my academic colleagues when I published this book, but I found so much in the UFO community itself, and it was shocking to me at first. I've sort of come to understand it more, and it's the same thing that exists within academia too. But I think it's important that we all maintain an open mind and look at everything critically, not just accept whatever is forced upon us, but that we're also cordial and collaborative with each other and aren't just at each other's throats, because we'll get a lot farther and we'll get more push into the mainstream, I think, as well, if we do. And this show and what you did here today is a great example of that, bringing people on to talk about these things and get ideas out there and debate them in very cordial ways.
Yeah, you know what happens, though, Doctor, is that when things run a little slow, idle hands are kind of the devil's workshop. Mm. And that is, I mean, I've seen it. It's not all a flat line. Right. Things get busy and then things slow up. And then when things do slow up, people tend to start picking at each other a little bit. And that has happened. We've even seen it over the last 2.5 years or so. That kind of thing does happen. And, actually, that was one of the ideas that I had for putting together this show. Sometimes rather than just sitting around and picking at each other, let's do something like this where, we're saying it up front. We're just going to speculate wildly. We're just going to kick around as many different ideas as we can. None of us know 100% for sure how right or how wrong we are on any of this stuff, but let's just get on and speculate as wildly as we can and kick around as many out there ideas as we can, and let's just do that and keep ourselves occupied with something positive, and then eventually, we'll find out about more UFO cases. We'll find out more about what the government's doing about about UFOs. That stuff is going to come out. But I think we've seen over the last couple of years, it's going to come out slowly, and there are going to be some slow stretches. And you're just best off recognizing that, and as best you can, kind of step away from the kind of negativity that you're talking about. And, I'm as guilty as anybody else. I get involved with it. I get into flame wars and arguments with people over this and that. And when all else fails, I can always argue with my co-host Chant, because that's all we do is argue, basically.
Yeah.
But
it's good to have that. It's healthy.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to get her to loosen up. We want our show to be as funny as the show that Reese and Leon do. But I'm having it's been a struggle getting her to loosen up on the show. I do have her insulting me constantly on Facebook now, so I've gotten her to that point. I just have to get her to loosen up a little bit more on the show.
Yeah.
So, anything else? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Leon. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it's the one thing I have to add, specifically to Mike, to the wonderful Dr. Masters, and the fact that I think he's a genius, not just because he can pull together all of the science around this and put together such a fantastic, case study and thought-provoking book, but he's a genius because time is so going to be on his side, because in the future, if they prove that time travel is possible and that we start going back in time, they're going to look back and go, who was the first person who really published this idea and actually put this out there in a very scientific way? And he's going to be the name that's remembered, very far into the future. And if not, if it's never proven that time travel is possible, well, that's never going to happen, is it? Because we're always going to be wondering whether or not we can time travel and whether or not science is there. So effectively, Mike's never going to be proven wrong, which is
covered
genius.
my bases. I think to be a genius, I would have had to consciously consider that before doing it. But this is the first time that's even crossed my mind. So,
or maybe he's already cracked time travel. He traveled into the future, figured it all out, and then came back.
Oh man!
And he's just doing that.
I'd love to visit the future. I mean, people always ask, what time period would you want to go back to? And I say, screw the past. I want to go to the future.
Exactly.
I want to see what happens in the time that we don't know about already.
I wouldn't mind going and visiting myself as a 8th grader and give a few tips.
Straighten yourself out a little bit.
Sports betting.
I can tell you that I'm pretty happy with where I'm at right now, so I can't complain too much. Everything that went wrong, who knows if I could go back and fix it, I might not be where I'm at. So,
yeah,
I'm more philosophical. Well, anyone else have anything to add before we wrap things up? I guess not. Okay. Well, let me thank our guests for today. Dr. Irena Scott, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Masters, thanks so much for joining us again.
Absolutely. It's a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Let's thank Leon Kirkbeck for joining us for the first time. Thank you very much, Leon, the rookie on the show today.
And look, I certainly hope I haven't ruined it for future opportunities as
well. No, not at all. Not at all. Absolutely. Definitely appreciate the humor and the great questions and the great feedback. And, of course, the one and only Rich Hoffman, who had to leave us a little early today. So, thanks for joining us, folks. We will be back next week with who knows what. And in the meantime, just take advantage of that social distancing. So thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great week. Thank you very much.
Right.
Bye-bye now.
Take care.
Thanks, Sam.